Okay, so we're talking today with Kellie Cody of Augusta, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Okay, so Kellie, begin with some background on yourself, and to begin with, where and when were you born?
Born September 11th, 1949, St. Mary's Hospital in Saginaw, Michigan.
Okay, and did you grow up in the Saginaw area or somewhere else?
I don't know where I was from birth to age 4. My first memory is Marshall. My family lived in a trailer. My father was a mechanic. Him and my mother moved to Michigan. They're from the South. My dad's from Kentucky, and my mother's from Virginia, and they moved north to get work. And so he's what I would call an itinerant mechanic. In other words, he moved from place to place to place to place.
Okay, and so where did you wind up going to high school?
2 places. So my older brother, Larry, was killed in a car accident when I was in 8th grade. And my mother's sister and her husband lived in Bristol, Virginia. And my parents were separated at the time, and then they came back together. And my aunt offered my mother a job, and so we moved to Bristol, Virginia. So I went to school in Bristol, Virginia for 3 years. Then my mother moved back to Michigan, and I graduated from Galesburg Augusta High School in 1967.
All right. Now, as this stuff was going on, were you paying any attention to the news in the world or
No.
That kind of thing? When you finished high school, then what did you do?
I did what we were all supposed to do, and that's go to college.
Okay.
And so I started the fall year after my high school at Kellogg Community College in computer programming, and realized computer programming wasn't for me, and I thought I would go into business because I wanted to be rich. And Kellogg did not have a business program. Kalamazoo Valley did, and I was living in Augusta at the time. That's where my mother lived. So I dropped out of the spring semester. So I went to 1 semester at Kellogg, dropped out for the spring semester. I could not get into Kalamazoo Valley. So I was going to wait until the fall. Well, lo and behold, Uncle Sam said, I want you in the Army, and I was drafted.
Okay. So when do you get the draft notice, roughly?
Oh gosh, this must have been like late April, early May.
Of what year?
Of 68.
Okay. All right.
No, what
Or
day?
69?
69.
Okay.
69.
All right. And so you get the draft notice, so now what happens?
I go to Detroit to go do the physical. You had to show up for a bus ride in Kalamazoo. Went to Kalamazoo, got on the bus, go to Detroit, get my physical.
So what do you remember about the physical?
Just standing in line. It was, I don't think there were any females, all guys, all in the drafting process, and I don't even remember what tests they did, but I just remember walking from station to station and standing in line, standing in line, standing in line. And then when we're done, they took us back home to Kalamazoo, and then a few days later, it must have been about 2 weeks, I got notices to go where to go, and that was Fort Knox, Kentucky.
All right. And then how do they get you together to get down to Fort Knox?
We went to Kalamazoo, got on the bus, headed to Fort Knox.
All right. And what kind of reception do you get at Fort Knox?
Kind of like what you get in the movies, guys screaming at you, telling you where to go, and we were in a holding unit before we went into our basic training unit. And so I had quit smoking prior to going in, and then when I got into the service, everybody was smoking, it seemed. So I started smoking again, and that was in the holding unit. And so we were there for about 2 weeks, got our uniforms, did all our paperwork, all that, and then we got assigned to a basic training unit, and thankfully we were in the new buildings, which were concrete block buildings, which weren't air conditioned, but they were a lot nicer and they had thick mattresses as opposed to the thin mattresses that we had in the holding unit, so it was fairly comfortable.
Or at least by Army standards, it was an improvement.
By Army standard, it was an improvement, that's correct.
All right. And what did the basic training consist of at that point?
PT a lot. We did physical therapy training every morning. Learned how to use bayonet. We had bayonet training. We learned how to fire. In 14, those were the training rifles that we had, which were really good, actually a good rifle. And some classes about combat. Other than that, I don't remember a lot about basic training, except for we had this one guy in our unit who constantly complained and constantly complained and constantly complained. And so we were going across to the PX, which you go across the field probably as far near that tree, maybe 100, 150 yards. And he was complaining. Well, in Kentucky in July, it was pretty hot. So they had these, what they call clister barrels, 50-gallon drums filled with ice and water. And I remember our first sergeant taking him by the nape of the neck and dunking him into that 50-gallon drum and bringing him back out. And of course he was, and never complained again.
All right. Yeah. What was the discipline like?
We were fortunate, and I was throughout the Army. We had a fair drill sergeant. The other drill sergeants were highly disciplinary. I mean, he kept us in line, but he did it more out of respect than out of authority. You know, he treated us fair, and we performed for him. So,
okay,
African American guy, but really a great guy.
All right. Because so the standard line is something along the lines of, you know, they're supposed to break you down and build you back up again. Was that part of the experience, or were you just being told what to do and doing it?
I don't think my drill sergeant was like that. I think the other drill sergeants that were in our company were. Clearly, the only breaking down I can remember is you will follow our rules, not yours. You don't follow our rules, you will do low crawl, push-ups, whatever happened. It seemed like that was the punishment, was doing PT. So, but we really had he was really a fair man. He was a staff sergeant at the time.
Okay.
And yeah, I don't remember that breaking down other than the rules.
Okay. Now, how easy or hard was it for you to adjust to life in the Army?
Relatively easy. I was a follower, and that's part of why I was talking about OCS. That's part of why I dropped out of OCS. I wasn't a leader, I was a follower. So you tell me what to do, I'll do it. You say crawl 6 inches, I'll crawl 6 inches. You say crawl 6 feet, I'll crawl 6 feet. So I got in good with our first sergeant. Never had a problem with him. And so I think that was mainly it.
Okay. All right. About how long was the actual training?
8 weeks for
Okay.
basic,
All
8
right.
weeks for AIT.
Okay. And so you do advanced individual training next, and where did you go for that, and what did you do?
So I'm still probably 2 blocks down the road to my training for my to become a radio mechanic. So when I first went in, I took all the tests and everything to become a helicopter pilot. But and that was what I wanted to do in the Army. And they would not let me in helicopter school, although I did all the academic stuff okay. And because of my eyesight, you had to have 20/20 vision, and I wasn't there. So aptitude-wise, and again, this is them choosing everything for me, because being drafted, we didn't get to choose, so they sent me to radio mechanic school, and I flew through that. That was it was easy.
Okay. But did you have any knowledge of electronics or anything else like that when you went in?
No, other than my dad being a mechanic and kind of hanging around him and learning the little bits and things from him. No, but nothing with electronics.
Okay. All right. So what does a radio mechanic actually train to do?
Repair radios. Any radio that they had in the Army, I could fix, and the way it was set up was fairly simple. It was repair or replace. And so you had equipment that tested the radios and basically told you what part was bad. Replace this part. That doesn't work. Replace the whole radio.
Now, were you with a class of people going through at the same time?
Yeah. There was probably 25, 30 other guys in the same class.
So maybe not as big as an infantry training company or something like that?
No, it was a fairly small group compared to some of the others.
Okay. And what sorts of people were training you there?
Well, they're all Army, all NCOs for the most part. Don't have a clue what their background was. We knew who they were and what their rank was. That was about it.
Okay. All right. Now, is AIT, does it have a different atmosphere than basic training?
Oh yeah, you've got a lot more freedom, a lot more respect. I could have a car, which I couldn't have in basic training, so I went home, got my car, and brought it back. Most weekends off, go in town, do whatever you want to do. You couldn't do that in basic. I think we had one leave in basic, but food was much better. Really had good cooks in AIT. You pretty much, like for breakfast, you could get whatever you wanted to eat. Bacon, eggs, pancakes, sausage, whatever you wanted. Not so in basic. You got what they threw on your plate.
Right. Okay. All right. So is that another 8 weeks or?
Another 8 weeks, yeah.
Okay. Now, what was your next step after completing AIT?
That's when I went to OCS.
Okay. How did you wind up going to OCS? Or when did that decision come down, or how did that work?
I don't remember exactly, but because of my aptitude and how well I was doing, one of the NCOs asked me what I wanted to do, and I said, "Man, I wanted to be a helicopter pilot, but they won't let me in." He said, "Would you ever think about OCS?" I said, "What's OCS?" He said, "Officers Candidate School." I said, "No, never would have thought." So he said, "I think you'd do okay in OCS," and I said, "Okay." He said, "The only thing, you're going to have to re-enlist for 3 years." And I said, "Okay." And re-enlisted, and they sent me to Fort Benning.
All right.
I got to leave first to go home for a few weeks, and then they sent me to Fort Benning.
Okay. And so how much of the officer training did you actually do?
8 weeks.
Okay. And what did that consist of?
Tactical training for combat. We trained on every hand weapon that you could use, from a pistol up to a 50 caliber machine gun. Grenades, hand-to-hand combat. What else? Classes every day on tactical kinds of things. PT was one of the, we ran everywhere, so a lot of running, and that was in basic AIT, not AIT. We didn't do PT and AIT, but in OCS we did a lot of it. So I was in really good shape when I was in the Army.
Okay.
You didn't ask me about this, but during the time I was after AIT, before going to OCS, I got married
Okay.
to my high school sweetheart, and so we got married, and that was in December of '69,
Mhm.
and then I went to OCS, I think in January, or mid-January.
Okay.
thereabouts.
All right. Now, did she stay up in Michigan, or
She
did
stayed in Michigan. She was from Galesburg. Her family was dairy farmers, right outside, right southwest of Galesburg, and she was going to Kalamazoo Valley at the time. So, and she ended up being a teacher. So.
Okay. Now, as for you, now when you're in OCS, is the expectation that you're going to be an infantry lieutenant in Vietnam?
Correct. Everybody was it was a infantry OCS, and everybody was going to Vietnam, and that didn't bother me one way or the other. Never thought about Vietnam either. Never had a fear of it, nor had a thought about it,
Mm-hmm.
and that didn't affect me even making the decision to go, because I knew that was the case before I went to OCS, but it had nothing to do with me dropping out.
Okay.
The reason I dropped out was, as I told you earlier, I was a follower, not a leader. So why I took OCS, I still to this day don't quite understand. But they were wanting us to teach a course to the other cadets, and we had to develop the course and create it. And I wasn't a man out front, and I dropped out.
Mm-hmm.
To this day, I regret doing that. I wish I had stayed.
Okay. Now, what's the actual process of dropping out? Once you decided, okay, this is not for me, what did you do?
It's called a DOR, drop on request. I just told my platoon sergeant, or platoon officer, who was not a sergeant, that I wanted to drop out, and he didn't encourage me to go one way or the other, and said okay. Had he encouraged me to stay, I may have stayed.
Mm-hmm.
But he didn't. He was a good lieutenant, though. Similar in a lot of ways to my drill sergeant.
Now, did you have a sense, had he been anywhere yet, or was this maybe his first assignment?
I think so. I think this was one of his first
Yeah,
assignments.
because that's one of the things they would often do with new lieutenants is they put them in a training command first before
Yeah.
they went anywhere else.
Yeah. And that's, I think, what he was. I don't remember him ever talking about being in Vietnam or being in battle. He was a young guy. He was not much older than me. Probably, I would have been 19, maybe, and he was probably 22, 23.
Mm-hmm. Okay, all right. And by then, late '69, it probably wouldn't have been all that surprising that people might not want to finish.
Yeah. So I don't know what his motivation was, one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
He gave us orders, didn't talk about himself much.
Mm-hmm.
So there was no encouragement for people to drop on request, but when people did, and I wasn't the first, there were several before me, but they were earlier on. At 8 weeks, it was kind of strange, because the last 4 weeks is kind of a smooth sailing,
Mm-hmm.
but because it's a 12-week program, and but they just so when I left there, I went to this holding unit in Fort Benning, and then, like I was telling you, everybody was going to Vietnam but me.
Okay.
One other guy.
Yeah, can you tell that story sort of more fully? I mean, how did that process of deciding where people are going?
I don't know how they decided, but every morning we'd have formation, and there were, I don't know how many hundreds of people there were, but there were several formations. There were no orders, so we went back to our barracks and sat, and one day we came out, and they're walking down the line with back then everything was paper. You had your orders, they handed it to Vietnam, 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 Fort Bragg, Vietnam, Vietnam, and Fort Bragg was me, and I thought, oh, that's cool. I guess we'll go to Fort Bragg. And then down the next line in Vietnam. And one guy, he was kind of a chum of mine at the time, re-enlisted so he wouldn't have to go to Vietnam. And he was mad at me because I didn't re-enlist, and I didn't have to go to Vietnam. So he was upset that he had to re-enlist. And literally everybody but the two of us in that formation, there was probably 30, 40 guys, orders were to Vietnam.
So what was your enlistment status at this point? Because you had re-enlisted or whatever, you had extended to be officer candidate school, but was that obligation gone now because...
No, you re-enlisted, you're in. So my enlistment was still there. So the one nice thing about radio mechanic school is you got 2 ranks when you graduated. So I went in as an E2. I got out of basic training as an E2, got out of radio mechanic school as E4, so I was a Spec 4 at the time, which was very unusual for AITs to get. Most everybody made PFC, E3, and theirs. And so I made rank fairly fast, and when I went to Germany I made E5 fairly fast, and they were going to offer me E6 if I re-enlisted, but I decided not to.
Okay. So in the meantime, so you're coming out of officer candidate school, you're already at Spec 4 rank from your training.
Correct. So
okay,
right
you go
back
to
to that.
So you go to Fort Bragg, North Carolina,
Spec 4.
and now what happens to you?
I'm in the 503rd MPs, and I'm not an MP because I'm the radio mechanic, so there's me and one other guy fixed radios for him, and the MPs were spit shine and everything was perfect, and I never had to deal with that. So brought my wife down, and we lived in a trailer park outside of Fort Bragg, and did my thing there for about 6 months. Fixed radios.
What kinds of radios did MPs use?
Most of them are on attached to Jeeps, so, and I don't remember the names of them, but they're probably yay big. And because the MPs all use Jeeps, so they wouldn't have what you see today with things hanging on you, and you talk through that. You had to go to your Jeep, and if you want to talk to somebody. So, I mean, we had portable ones, but the portable ones were 6-inch by probably 18 inches, just if you wanted a portable one.
Okay, because I guess
Those are rare.
in the commercial sector, you were starting to get walkie-talkies and things like
Yeah,
that.
that was the walkie-talkie. It was huge. You didn't have it. It was not. I mean, I've got one now that's about 3 inches, and which is probably 3 times as powerful as the machine I had in there.
Right.
Never had to fix one of those though.
Okay. So what was your daily routine like while you were at Fort Bragg?
Come to work, go into my shop. Radio's there. If MP would call and say, "Are my radios not working?" one of us or both of us would go out. More often than not, take them a replacement because we couldn't fix it on the spot. So we always had a replacement with us. When we'd give them a replacement, we'd take theirs back, fix it if we could. If not, order a new one and go from there.
All right. And how much time a day do you think you actually spent working on radios?
Oh, probably on average an hour or 2.
Okay. So what do you do the rest of the time?
We play and do crazy stuff. Drive around in our Jeep. Get a 5-ton, drive that around. It was, and if there was, it wasn't every day that the radios went bad, and then some days you'd have 4 or 5 go bad. So it was either sink or swim, depending on the days. And there was nobody. My boss was an E5 sergeant, and he was just as crazy as I was. So when we didn't have anything to do, we just take the Jeep and drive around or go to town, whatever we want to do. Because literally there was nobody overseeing us. I don't think. I've never, other than company commander, I never met a NCO that was overseeing us. So, and then he, just before I went to Germany, he got out. So then I was pretty much in charge, and nobody said, "Oh, you report to me." We had a first sergeant,
Mm-hmm.
so that's who I reported to, and that was just a few weeks, and then I got my orders to go to.
So you're pretty much just kind of left to your own devices then.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So it's not really a typical Army experience already at that point.
Yeah. Well, they come in and they said, your job is to fix the radios.
Mm-hmm.
And as long as you did that, nobody bothered me.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the things I found in the Army. As long as you do your job, nobody bothers you. You can do pretty much anything you want. Just do your job. Be on time, leave on time, do your job.
Okay. So how is it that you wind up going to Germany?
Have no clue. One day, the first sergeant came down and said, "Cody, you're going to Germany." I said, "Okay." And went home for a couple weeks and went to Germany, and was in a holding unit over there, and so my wife stayed home again,
Mm-hmm.
and some guy came out and said, "Can anybody type?" These had about 6 guys raise their hand. I could type, but I didn't raise my hand.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just sitting there. A lot of that hurry up and wait, and that's pretty common in the
Mhm.
Army. So about 3 hours later, that guy comes up to me and says, "Cody, can you type?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Okay, you're going to Illesheim and you're going to be a clerk." I said, "Okay." So I did. That's where I went. I went to Illesheim and I was a clerk in the S1 office. And
Okay. So where is Illesheim?
about 48 kilometers southwest of Nuremberg. It's a little town.
Mm-hmm.
It had very rural. It had a bakery and a bar, and that's all that was in the town.
All right. And what was based there?
The tank battalion, and I don't know what else there was, because the tank battalion was primarily it, and the division headquarters, or the brigade headquarters was there. And I don't remember what the other units were, if they were. But
And so
the tank battalion was pretty huge.
Okay. And what tank battalion was it? What was its number?
It was the 4th Battalion.
Mm-hmm.
It was the 4th Armored Division when I first got there, and then it was the 4th Battalion, 1st Armored Division, when the 4th Armored Division disbanded.
Mm-hmm.
And I was in the headquarters unit because I was a part of S1, which was basically, we processed everybody into the unit and out of the unit,
Mm-hmm.
and all the legal stuff was in S1. And so then the legal clerk got out, and my sergeant said, "You're going to be a legal clerk." I said, "Okay." So I went from having a manual typewriter to do all my work to having to do electric typewriter, and that was strange, learning an electric
Mm-hmm.
typewriter for the first time. But again, I did my work. Nobody bothered me.
All
So
right.
that's one thing I learned. Do your job, and you don't have to get worried about people bothering you. And I wasn't.
All right. So when you're in this job now, how many hours a day do you actually spend working?
Oh, well, when I was a clerk, I spent basically a 7-hour day working
Mhm.
because I was processing stuff, and people were coming in and out. Then when I went to legal clerk, sometimes work overtime because we had some troublemakers in our battalion, and I knew I knew every one of them because they were getting Article 15s, or at the battalion level you can do a court martial, and so the battalion commander got to depend on me to counsel him on what he could and couldn't do if somebody had an offense. Cody, come in here. This guy did X, Y, and Z. What can I do? Well, you can do this, this, and this. You don't have to do any of them, but you can do this. So you can do it from an Article 15 to a court martial, depending on what it was. And sometimes, no, I don't think he ever asked me what my opinion was. But I gave him the facts, and he'd say, okay, let's do this. And I'd say, okay. And I'd go out and do the paperwork. He'd bring people in. And company commanders could do Article 15s. Only battalion commanders could do court martials. So I oversaw also the company legal clerks, and some of them liked me, some of them didn't, because I did things by the book. And the brigade legal clerk loved me because all my paperwork was always exactly the way it needed to be. So it zoomed through. He never had to do any work with mine. So they sent me around Germany training legal clerks who didn't know what they were doing. And everyone I found didn't know what they were doing is because they wanted to do it their way rather than the Army way. I said, just follow the Army way and it'll go through. Yeah, but I don't want to do it that way. I want to do it. That's why you're in trouble. That's why I'm down here. So just follow the book. If it says, say, ABC, you say ABC. You don't say ABD. ABC.
Okay. So how is it that the commander needed you to tell him what his options were? I mean, what did you know that he didn't?
I studied the laws in the Army because I wanted to know, when I was doing my paperwork, that I was doing it correctly and by the book. And he knew I understood the Uniform Code of Military Justice inside and out. My boss was a first lieutenant. He didn't know squat. So that's who should have been going to him, because he was the S1, I forget what his title was, but he knew I knew what I was doing, and he knew, based on my reputation, that through all the way up through the brigade, that I had a reputation for always doing things correctly and by the book, and so he depended on me.
Okay. What kind of relationship did you have with a lieutenant?
Strained relationship, because he didn't know his ass from a hole in the ground. Other than time, I'm not sure how he became first lieutenant, but he was not an S1 officer, and he did not have the same desire to make sure he understood the parameters of his job and what needed to happen. He depended on us a lot, which is pretty typical, I think, anyway. But and my boss, who was a staff sergeant, he was a Hispanic man. He was very, very intelligent, knew S1 up one side and down the other. Although he didn't know legal clerk, so once I became the legal clerk, I had this space to myself, and that's partly why I needed to know how to do it. So I would seek never had any training to do the legal clerk. I did it all on my own, but it got me out of a lot of stuff, a lot of extra work.
Well, did the guy that you replaced show you around at all, or say,
no,
here's what to do? No.
He was a cool dude, though. I mean, he basically showed me, here's where your papers are, here's how you do it, but no training from him. So part of the training was reading his Article 15s that he had done, read court martials that he had done, the ones that had gotten through, reading the Uniform Code of Military Justice. We had a SOP, standard operating procedure, for everything. That was for everything, how to march, how to shoot a rifle, whatever it was, you had an SOP for it. So you had that for Article 15s and court martials and so forth, so how to do them and how many copies they needed to be. And back then we were doing, when we were typing, we were using carbon paper, and so and it was good they had electronic typewriter for that, because Article 15s I think were in at least four copies. So to try to hammer through that with a manual just wasn't going to get it.
All right. You said you were. Where else? Do you remember where else you went in Germany? You said you were traveling around. Other bases you went to a lot.
Well, I went to other bases to train. Every summer, so I was there 2 summers. We had 2 weeks of field training,
Mm-hmm.
and so we'd go out in the field, and we had again we had it easy. The tank people. I'm thankful that I wasn't a radio mechanic because they were always dirty and greasy, and I'm not a dirty, greasy kind of guy. So we go out and set up our personnel carrier, and then we had a big tent that came out the back and had a stove, and we just sat and did it. It was like taking our office
Mm-hmm.
to the field.
Yeah. So
we weren't doing anything.
Yeah. A legal clerk doesn't really have a combat assignment at that point.
No combat assignment. Yeah, in fact, it wasn't until towards the end that they realized I wasn't doing CQ duty, which all E5s had. So I got E5 rank pretty quick because as soon as I became a legal clerk, I got E5.
Mm-hmm.
And E5 you had to go through before a board, and it was like all the people on the board, the XO, and everybody knew me. So it was like basically, what's your name? Which easy
Mm-hmm.
stuff. Because they knew they were going to promote me. So yeah, no combat assignment, and CQ was you had to stay up overnight and answer the phone if anything happened
Mm-hmm.
overnight, and if it did, you contacted the officer, and the officer came in and took care of it. So I had to do that the last few months I was in.
You had also mentioned that you went to train other people how to do your job. And did you go to other bases to do that?
Oh yeah. Well, I got to fly in a helicopter. The XO for our battalion, who was a major. So the battalion commander was a lieutenant colonel.
Mm-hmm.
The XO was a major. The company commanders were all captains, and the S1 officer was a lieutenant, first lieutenant. So the XO, they wanted this. I guess this one company in southern Germany, I don't remember exactly where it was having major problems. So it was like an emergency. So the XO said, "I'm going down to wherever this was. Do you want to go along with me?" I said, "Sure." So he was a helicopter pilot, so he flew us down. So I got to actually fly in a helicopter for the first and last time. I've never been in one since, but he was nuts. He would test it out. I became a private pilot after I got out of service, but to test the helicopter, he had to do several maneuvers, and one of the maneuvers he did was about 20 feet off the ground. He would go sideways at about 70 miles an hour, and then turn it on its side to stop it. And so I'm looking out the window. I'm flying sideways, and then all of a sudden I'm looking straight at the ground. But he was a good pilot. I mean, he did everything perfect. And so as we're flying, I'm just mesmerized about flying over.
All right. So what was the
Castles,
situation in the company that you were helping out?
They weren't. He wanted to do it his way, and so the brigade guy,
Mm-hmm.
also an African American dude, although that doesn't matter, but he said, "Cody, you got to go down and teach whoever it was how to do it," because he knew I never had anything come back.
Mm-hmm.
He was always sending the stuff back to this guy. He said he can't do anything right.
Mm-hmm.
So really the brigade guy should have went down, but
Mm-hmm.
because it was in the brigade, they sent me the battalion legal clerk down to train this guy, and within 5 minutes I knew what the problem was.
Mm-hmm.
He said, "I don't have to do it that way." "Yes, you do have to do it that way." "No, I don't have to." "Well, are you getting the stuff sent back?" "Yes, because they don't know how to do it." Follow the manual. Here's the manual. Here it says when you do this, write it this way. It doesn't say write it your way. It says write it this way. So that's the one I remember most because he was pathetic as I can't imagine how he even made it in the Army.
Okay. Now, do you have any sense whether or not the people you were working with, or the people in your battalion, had many of them been to Vietnam, or had they spent all their time in Germany?
Most of the NCOs had been to Vietnam, and they were on a return tour. My boss, who was an E6 staff sergeant, he'd been to Vietnam, but he always had been in. He was a finance guy, so he'd always been in the background. The upper E6 is probably and above tank people had been to Vietnam. It wasn't talked about.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't talk about Vietnam.
Okay.
And they didn't talk about Vietnam.
Now, did you go off base much at all?
Oh yeah, all the time. In fact, I lived in when my wife came over, we lived in Bad Windsheim, which was the next town over, and it was a little bit bigger. It had 3 bars and a couple restaurants, and we had an apartment over there. And we traveled all over while we were there. We went to a friend, the re-enlistment NCO was a good friend of mine, and him and his wife and me and my wife would travel to, we went to Italy, another couple of, 3 couples went to England, went to France. Germany is, for Europe, is located pretty central, so on a weekend you could go to Italy, on a weekend you could go to France, on a weekend you could go to Brussels, wherever you wanted to go. So it was, Italy, or England was a little bit different because you had, you couldn't get, well, they have a tunnel now, but back then you had to take a ferry across,
right.
So it was a little bit more difficult, but we went over to England, spent time in London.
Now, you're in Europe now. This is early 1970s,
Yeah,
or thing.
71, 72.
Okay. How did people view or treat Americans there?
It was kind of a dual way. They loved us because we brought money to the town. They hated us because we were Americans. So it was a love-hate kind of relationship. And some of it was justified because I think a lot of the guys took advantage of the young females that were in the town. And some got knocked up, some didn't, but so that was a problem issue. Most of the Americans seemed to feel like they were better than the German people, and I never had that because I grew up poor, so I knew I wasn't much better than anybody else. And so I learned enough German to get by, and where we were, we lived in an apartment, and the lady who owned the apartment lived in the upstairs apartment, and she had 2 daughters. I always respected them. And, you know, she wanted me to do something, I'd go up and do it for her, and so we got along really well. But I think it was a love-hate relationship back then.
Was that just kind of a social thing, or was, if you went into cities or things like that, were there?
Yeah, I think it was more social, because when we go to Nuremberg, and if you went in your civilian clothes, you were wearing basically the same thing they were, so they didn't know. They could tell you were in the Army because you had short hair, and everybody else had long hair at the time. So, yeah, I think it was more of a social thing. You know, I think, as I look back, I think we were invaders in their country, and so there were numerous, and still are numerous, bases in Germany, and I think that still goes on today. You're outsiders in our country, and yet they want us there because we protect them from invasion and so forth. So it's a strange thing. It was back. I'm guessing it's still the same.
Okay. Now, in the time that you were there, was there much concern over, Cold War type issues, or how worried was anybody about the Soviets attacking, or were there
Oh
alerts?
yeah, they were worried about that. In fact, I can remember at all the train stations, people, military with automatic weapons. I remember we was driving up to Nuremberg one time and we got stopped by these police officers, and they all had automatic weapons, and they were looking for somebody. Who they were looking for, I don't know. But so you didn't mess with, you follow their orders. They don't do it. You get by okay. So I mean, we had nothing to worry about because we weren't troublemakers. We weren't carrying weapons. We weren't doing anything but traveling, and they quickly understood that and sent us on our way. But I can remember automatic weapons on a lot of corners.
And did you have any kind of alerts or things like that on the base?
Not really. No, I can't remember any. No, I can't remember any alerts on the base.
Okay.
They were military in nature, combat in nature. It was basically the tanks would go out and play, and we'd go out in the summer and they'd fire and do their war games, and that was about as close you got to war. And then I didn't have a clue what they did once they got back into the base, because I was in my desk.
Right.
That's where I stayed. Got up in the morning, ate, went to work.
Okay. As you traveled around, did you ever go to West Berlin?
Nope, never went to Berlin.
Okay.
Wish I had though. I thought that would have been cool while the wall was still there. Now that the wall's down.
Right. All right. You think back about the time spent in Germany. Are there other particular memories or impressions that stand out for you?
So that's the end of my Army career, but as I remember back over the Army, I had a really good tour of duty everywhere I went. I got good assignments. People respected me, and I learned I learned my job. So the Army for me was a really positive experience, and I mean, I was also one to test boundaries on occasion. If there was something that I didn't think was fair, or I interpreted a rule in a certain way and operated based on my interpretation. I remember getting in verbal scuffles with the XO because he was a by the book kind of guy too. So we'd get in these, especially about the legal stuff, and I was almost every case was right. I'd say, no, no, sir, that's not the way it is. It's this way. And he'd say, no, it's this way. Bring out the book. Here it says, right here. Okay. And my first sergeant guy, he's the one that I remember his name was. He was a Polak. His name was Sergeant Partica. And I remember him come. I was always trying to get over on him, and he had this phrase he used that I've used probably 1,000 times since then. And so I don't remember what it was, but I was trying to get over on him one day, and he said, Cody, he said, don't piss on my leg and try to make me believe it's raining. And I thought, okay, Sergeant Partica. And then that stuck with me. And I don't know how many times I've used that with people who are trying to get over on me, and it's kind of a funny way to make a point, but it's a wonderful phrase to use.
Okay. How much of an effort did the Army make to get you to stay?
Little to none. Like I say, my best friend well, one of them we had 2 or 3 couples that we liked to do things with, but he was the reenlistment NCO, and he was trying to get me to reenlist at the same time he was getting ready to discharge. And I said, well, why you want me to stay, but you're not staying? Well, that's a totally different thing. I said, no. He said, so they offered me E6, I'd say, and so that's about the only thing they did. And he knew that I was ready to go, so he didn't put pressure on me. But he was a good reenlistment NCO. He got people a lot of what they asked for. So.
All right. So did you know what you wanted to do when you got out?
Not a clue. All I knew is I would. I purchased a BMW limousine, an old, really beautiful old car. I started out with a Taunus, which was a German Ford, and every day I had to go out and put gas in the carburetor to get it started, because we didn't make a lot of money, so it was, and then that worked, so what the heck. And then when I got E5, I said, okay, we're going to buy a different car, so I bought this BMW limousine. And when I got out, as an E5, the Army moves everything for you. E5, below E5, you have to do everything yourself. So they came in, packed our apartment up, they shipped my car. I picked my car up in New Jersey, drove it home, and that was my car for the longest of time.
All right. So what did you do when you got out?
Went back to school.
Okay.
So I went back to Kalamazoo Valley Community College, finished. So before I got drafted, and while I was going to school, I was working full-time for the state. So I worked at, my mother worked at this home for mentally retarded. Today they'd be called developmentally disabled. Back then they were called mentally retarded. Fort Custer, which is right outside of Augusta, was a military base during World War II. And so they converted some of these old military barracks to housing units for these mentally retarded, from kids to geriatrics. And so when I graduated, my mother said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "I don't know." She said, "Well, they need men to work at out at the state hospital." She said, "Go put your application in." So I did. They hired me, and so I worked at the home with mentally handicapped, physically handicapped adult males. And so when I went into the service, and I got out, I went back to work for, because I knew they were going to save my job. They were, and at that time they were doing deinstitutionalization, and they were moving everybody into the community, so they were closing Fort Custer. So I spent the next probably 6 to 8 months taking mentally retarded all over the state to go to foster homes. And then they had an opening at Kalamazoo State Hospital in the children's unit for, back then we were called attendant nurses. And so I just transferred to Kalamazoo and went to work at the children's unit at State Hospital, worked with pre-adolescent boys, and went to school. That was the thing you do, you go to school. It was kind of like, you tell me what to do, I'll do it. So that was the follower thing about me. So I went back and I started Kalamazoo Valley in the business program. And so when I was in high school, I didn't do well in academics. When I was in, it wasn't because I wasn't intelligent, but when I got to Kellogg Community, I didn't do well. I passed everything but one course that I didn't like. But when I got out of the Army, something about the Army changed me, and I got much more focused, and I think it was the legal clerk, and being ignorant about how to do my job and having to learn how to do it through books and all sorts of things. So I graduated with honors from, I got an associate degree in business, and then went to Western to get my
New
bachelor's degree, and I realized that business wasn't what I wanted to do, and I think that was partially from working with mentally retarded and mentally ill, mentally retarded adults and mentally ill children, and I decided I was going to go into psychology. So I started psychology in Western. Well, Western was all, their psychology program was all behavioral at the time, so it was all working with mice and rats, and I said, no, I don't want to work with mice and rats. So I switched to social work, and at that same time, about that same time, my wife and I separated, so I was kind of on my own, and got my bachelor's degree in social work, again, graduated summa cum laude. So academically I was doing pretty good, actually, and then got a job in working with the Native Americans on the reservations as the lone social worker on we had 4 reservations at the time, and then I went back and got my master's. So it was basically, this is what you do, work and go to school, so that's what I did.
And what are you doing now?
Right now?
Yeah.
I'm the ombudsman for the veterans homes. We have 2 veteran homes, one in Grand Rapids called the Grand Rapids Home for Veterans, and one in Marquette called the DJ Jacobetti Home for Veterans. And so from the time I got out of the service until about 8 years ago, the fact that I was in the Army was not a part of who I was. Then my son, so my father was in World War II. My father-in-law was in World War II. I was in during the Vietnam era. Then my son decided to, my old son decided, Brian decided to join the National Guard. So he went in the National Guard, and then he got deployed to go to Iraq. So I got back involved in working with the military. So there was a deployment event that we went to, and there's an organization called Buddy to Buddy. I don't know, are you familiar with Buddy Buddy? So it's vets helping vets. And so I saw the table over there, and I went over and talked to the guy, and he says, here's what we do. And I thought, well, you know, my son's now in the service, so maybe this is a good thing for me to do. So I got trained as a Buddy to Buddy volunteer, and got assigned to a transportation unit that my son was in, actually. Then they got deployed, and so they assigned me to that unit while they were deployed. So then they gave me the 109th Artillery, and that's who I stayed with for the most part. Well, while I was in there, so what our role was to educate veterans and soldiers about the benefits that they are eligible for and deserve, and help them and guide them to those. And one of the things I found out was there were a lot of veterans who literally, you could tell they had symptoms of PTSD. And I would talk to them about going to the VA and getting help for that, because we have evidence-based programs. So I was in mental health for most of my life and taught for a while. But the story I got was, I'm not going to the VA. It's either they've had a bad experience or one of their buddies that had a bad experience. And so there were all of these guys who needed mental health care who would not go to the VA, and this was kind of before they started allowing them to go to private places. So I was a family therapist at the time, so I went back and got trained in CBT, and there's a clinic in Richland. It's part of a church, but they were doing, all their services were free of charge. They didn't charge anybody. And so the church that I was going to at the time, that was their clinic, and so I knew the pastor who was overseeing it, and so I went and talked to him and said, Rob, here's what I'm finding as I'm talking to veterans every weekend or every month in their weekend services. And I said, what would you think about me coming and doing therapy for them at the clinic? So he said, oh, that's a good idea. So we spent about 4 or 5 months figuring out how to do that. They were remodeling the building. As soon as I got done with that, I started doing that. So I marketed myself to all the units on Fort Custer, set up flyers, went and talked to people. Everybody thought it was a wonderful idea, but so had a number of referrals, officers enlisted, mostly by word of mouth, and so I treated vets with PTSD for about 1.5 years at that clinic as a volunteer. And I was teaching at the same time too, so at Spring Arbor University, so it worked out really well. I was an associate professor there.
Okay. Now this tape is about up, so I'm going to pause it right here.
Where do we stop?
Okay. All right. So we were talking about how you had kind of set yourself up as a kind of a PTSD therapist,
yeah.
or whatever, and so you were connecting with different units that were based at Fort Custer. And
yeah, well, one of the things, I got my PhD in interdisciplinary health sciences, and I got very interested in evidence-based practices. So when I had been trained as a family therapist, and so I knew that I needed to go back and learn an evidence-based approach for PTSD. So that's I was teaching CBT
and what is CBT?
Cognitive behavioral therapy.
Okay.
I was teaching that at Spring Arbor, and so, but I wasn't trained. So I went back. The VA does some really good online training, so I did online training. Started utilizing it. Found very successful in working with individuals with PTSD. Had a good success rate with the clients I was working with. But when what I found was that veterans also have very low help-seeking behaviors, and so everything kind of dried up. I treated all these guys, and whoever they referred,
Mm-hmm.
and they didn't refer me to anybody else. So I decided that. Well, this job came about. You were asking me about
Mm-hmm.
the ombudsman job, and if you followed the news, you knew there were a lot of back in 2015 were major issues at the Grand Rapids home.
Mm-hmm.
They had privatized the direct care staff, and they had an organization called J2S who was providing care, and it was extremely low quality care. They were falsifying documents, abusing, then 11 people who were indicted. Anyway, so because I was very interested and concerned about veterans and veteran services and the VA and so forth, my Senator, Margaret O'Brien, was the chair of the Military Veterans Committee in the Senate, the state Senate. So once I read the news, I called up Margaret O'Brien and I said, what are you doing about the problems at the Veterans Home? Well, we're trying to figure out what they are. And so for about 1.5 years, once a month, once every couple months, I called Margaret O'Brien and said, what are you doing now? And it was like snail's pace is what they were doing. Then I found out that they created this ombudsman position, and because I've been complaining for a year and a half about the problems at the Grand Rapids home, I was in a position where I figured I better put my money where my mouth is, and if I'm going to complain, why not throw your hat in the ring and do something about it? So I talked to my wife and family, and I said, here's what I'm going to do, because I was getting ready to retire from teaching.
Mm-hmm.
I'd been teaching at Spring Harbor. And so I threw my hat in the ring and got an interview. A couple weeks after the interview, got hired. And so we had numerous ombudsmen in Michigan. I was within the Legislative Services Bureau, which is the Legislative Council, which is a nonpartisan group of legislators, oversaw this Legislative Services Bureau. And there were 3 appointed positions by the council. One was the administrator, myself, and the corrections ombudsman. The corrections ombudsman had several staff, and they investigated complaints of inmates within the corrections system. So I developed the Veterans Ombudsman from the ground up. Had a wonderful person I worked with in IT who was a programmer, and we developed our own electronic medical records, EMR, so I could track everything and get data, because data was a big issue for me. So then working with Keith Barber, who's the correction ombudsman, I won't say he trained me, but every time I had a question, I would go ask him, how do you do your job? What problems do you have? So I had to develop all the policies and procedures, which I had done. I'd been a CEO in so when I was in mental health, I started out as a therapist and then got in administration and did that most time. And my last mental health job was a CEO in a residential program, so I knew all about policies and so forth. So I did all that. But my main task was to oversee the Department of Military and Veteran Affairs and what had just started, which was the Military and Veteran Affairs Agency, to ensure that they were providing quality care to our veterans.
Mm-hmm.
And my primary customer, although they see it differently, the MVAA.
Okay, we're pretty close.
The MVAA saw me as my primary customer was the legislature.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, no, my primary customer is the veterans. And so I would set up a time to go to the veterans' homes, which is different. Corrections ombudsman, they only go when there's a complaint, but I felt like I needed to be there so they had a voice.
Mm-hmm.
And so I became their voice. And investigated complaints, made recommendations to the department on how to fix things. It's a very political position in that there are 4 committees that oversee veterans issues. A policy committee in the House and the Senate, and an appropriations committee in the House and the Senate. So I interacted really closely, excuse me, with the chairs, co-chairs, always went to those committees. Well, we had a changeover in leadership in the last election, which we have a new governor, attorney general, and so forth. And so that's been a transition. But primarily, I'm a voice for the vets.
Mm-hmm.
And challenge both homes to do a better job than what they're doing, and seek out areas that need improvement and make make recommendations for how to improve it. One of the things I found was that our veterans were getting substandard mental health care. And I did a review of records and submitted a report to the CEO at the time of the MBA, and so I was getting ready to do a new review, and we have this new administration in, and now they're stalling for me to get into the mental health records, and they're citing the mental health code, substance abuse code, HIPAA. So in my public act, though, it says, I shall have access to records and I shall be HIPAA compliant. So this new administration is much less cooperative than the previous one in terms of me doing my job. But that's basically what I do.
All right. Okay. I think you, to a certain extent, addressed this already, but overall, how do you think that your time in the service affected you, or what did you take out of it?
Affected me in this job?
Or just generally, including the job? But.
Well, like I say, from the time I got out until the time my son went into the service, it was I'll call it a hidden piece of who I am. Since then, I've learned, and so during the Vietnam era, when you were out of the service, we were told, don't ever travel in your uniform. Always wear civilian clothes. Don't talk to people about that you're in the service, because we were even though I wasn't in combat, we were baby killers, and the civilian world was really against us. And so I think many of the veterans who were in the Vietnam era just tucked it away. So I think from that perspective, it really didn't impact me. When I started working back with veterans again, I realized how prideful veterans really are about their service and how patriotic they are. And then I learned that about myself. And when I took on this job, I realized how many barriers were non-existent just by the fact that I was a veteran. Mm-hmm. Whether I'd been in combat or not, that didn't matter. When I said I'm an Army vet, we all signed the same contract. We all agreed to give up our life if need be. Didn't matter whether you're in the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, or Coast Guard. That's what you did. And so there's a brotherhood. So I think that's there. When I was growing up, we moved so many times. I really didn't have friends. I had a brotherhood. In the service, I had the brotherhood, and in working with veterans, there was that brotherhood. So I think, if anything else, that's probably the thing that's affected me most, is being prideful about my service and understanding that every branch of the service is a part of that brotherhood.
All right. Well, it makes for an unusual story.
Yeah.
Definitely different. So thank you very much for coming and sharing it today.
Thank you for doing this. I appreciate it. Appreciate your time.